Mm, All right. I think we can start. Cool, cool. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining today's web hack. Uh, Give me a sec. Okay. Yeah. So today we are pretty honored to invite Thomas Brezinski to join us to share about Obsidian nodes plugin development. So this is today's schedule. So I'll do a quick introduction to WebHack, and then we will have a short talk from Thomas and then Q&A afterward. Before we start, I'm gonna introduce WebHack a little bit. So WebHack is a Tokyo-based technical meetup. We used to host in-person events in different offices, but after pandemic, we go mainly online. But with that said, if you or your company are interested in hosting events, please contact us. And even though we went online, we still have the community is still growing. So we have 1,600 members, and also we have more than 2,000 attendees till now. And now we have our YouTube channel. So please go to YouTube and search for a WebHack Meetup and subscribe to our channel to get the updated videos. And also today's video will be live streaming in YouTube and also will be archived as a YouTube video. So if you missed any content, you can just go to our channel to check it out. And then we are call for talks. So if you are interested in sharing technical things in whatever topics, you can just contact us through a link. I'll post the link in the chat afterward. So without further ado, I'll hand over the microphone to Thomas. Thomas, it's all yours.
Thanks, Shooting. Thanks, everyone. As you mentioned, my name's Thomas Brezinski. I'm an engineer at Indeed. I work on one of the same teams with Shooting, and I've been in Tokyo for about the last 5 years and using Obsidian as one of my daily tools for at least the last year. And like a lot of people who use Obsidian, I probably talk about it too often and try to convince other people to use it too often. And so Shooting asked me to talk today about some of the basics of how I use it, as well as how I've written plugins to kind of help accelerate, my personal workflow with it. And so for today's talk, I'm actually going to present all of it from Obsidian itself. So we'll do the talk from Obsidian, and I think we can post a link to the vault in the Zoom chat. Cheating, would you mind reposting that since it's harder for me to see the chat now? And actually, I'll put it up here as well. There's a repository on GitHub called WebHack Vault. And this vault, what's in this repo, is actually just the entire presentation and the actual vault I'm presenting from. So all the plugins that are installed and configured in any certain way. So I guess before we actually get into any of the details, something that you can do if you're interested in following along is you can actually just download this repository itself, assuming you have Obsidian installed. Then when you launch Obsidian, you can choose to open an existing directory as a vault. And so you can open up this directory as a vault, and it will give you exactly what you're going to be seeing today. And that way, if there's anything we go over too quickly, or if there's links to some of the other references you want to revisit, they're all here for you. Before I begin, is this reasonably large font for everyone? Should I embiggen this a little bit? Okay, I saw at least one thumbs up. Okay, so I'm not sure how many people are already familiar with Obsidian, so I'll give a brief overview of kind of what it is. We're not going to go super in depth trying to evangelize why you should switch to Obsidian. There are a lot of really great videos and documents about all of the features, but just in case people are not familiar with Obsidian or haven't used it personally before, it is a note-taking app. It's a very powerful one, and it facilitates kind of building your own digital mind or knowledge base and a lot of personal workflows. If you've used other notes apps like Evernote, Bear, Apple Notes Keep, or probably the most recent one being Notion is more similar to Obsidian. It's kind of something you can compare it to. but Obsidian does offer enough personal customization and flexibility that most of these are a little bit apples to oranges with how Obsidian will work for you. Um, at its core, though, like a lot of these other ones, like Bear, for example, it's a Markdown-based notes app, but it also supports a lot of additional formats. So in your notes, besides the regular just Markdown that you could put in here, and if we kind of go in here, this is a live preview of what the actual underlying text is. You can also add metadata directly to your notes, which can be queried by other plugins and scripts. Um, Obsidian itself has many themes beyond just like the stock one it ships with. And some of these themes, for example, will add additional support for additional markdown elements, like additional states for to-dos. Of course, all the basics you'd expect, tables, code blocks. If you're using something like Bear, like tagging is a very common pattern for organizing your information. Obsidian itself has additional formatting like callouts that are kind of on top of the stock markdown. Comments in your notes, mermaid diagrams, latex. And if you've ever used Excalidraw, which is an open source drafting tool, um, you know, it's also supported in Obsidian natively with one of the, sorry, not natively. There's a Excalidraw plugin that allows you to integrate it as well. So really, whatever you want to put in your notes and however you want to write it is going to typically be supported. Uh, just calling out quickly that a lot of this in Obsidian is boils down to linking between your notes. And so you can see in the bottom right, just like a graph of all the notes that make up this presentation and which of those notes link to other notes. And you kind of see a hierarchy slowly evolving. So as you build your sort of wealth of knowledge, you'll kind of see natural clustering and organizations emerge. But the big call out here I want to make is compared to all those other ones, Obsidian's notes are all in Markdown format, so nothing proprietary, and they're all actually saved on your computer, on your device. So you can sync them between devices however you would like. There is a sync option through the Obsidian company where they will sync them for you. I think it's like $8 a month. But if you want to use Git, if you want to use iCloud, all the notes are in your possession and you can take them out of Obsidian whenever you'd like to. So if you open up your terminal and open up your vault, you'll find all of the notes that we're looking at as just markdown files on disks. Which also means if you wanted to do something to them outside of Obsidian, outside the Obsidian plugin ecosystem, you have direct access to all of them. Okay, so Obsidian's core gives you pretty much everything you need as a basic product. It does a lot for you, but there's also a rich plugin ecosystem. So at the time I wrote this, there are over 1,300 community plugins available. All those plugins are open source. You can install them through the Obsidian settings in this community plugins tab. You can enable community plugins. You can browse for them. It's a nice interface for this. I'll just give you the one shout out from the plugin security page on Obsidian that all of these are third-party code that you're letting run on your machine. They go through an initial audit as part of their submission, but there's inherent risk in running anybody else's code. So a couple things to keep in mind that they might have access to all your files, connect to the internet, install additional programs. So for example, me personally, I keep a separate vault for more personal documents, like if it's financial or health related or something like that. And I have a more generic vault that I have a lot more community plugins that I rely on. Real quick note about Obsidian's architecture, and this is kind of what we're already all looking at right now during this presentation. There's a couple like main elements in here. There's these ribbon actions on the left, and these are kind of quick ways to execute little commands. There's everything else in here for the most part is a view. So this graph down here in the bottom right is a view, this calendar is a view, this big box in the middle, which contains the editor is a view, and then the editor itself. And when you write plugins, you're able to change, modify, extend all of these things. There's also a command palette where you can run commands that come from either Obsidian itself or from specific plugins. So all of these are commands provided by various plugins. And the editor is based off CodeMirror, if you're familiar with that. It's a editor used in a lot of online kind of web appy tools. And so a lot of the functionality of code editor is also exposed in Obsidian. So anytime you're looking at what could be done with Obsidian, if CodeMirror supports it, a lot of that is also exposed through the Obsidian API. Even to the point where like you can actually call CodeMirror's some of those methods directly through the Obsidian API. And so there's an example here of someone using the CodeMirror's replace selection. Now, when you get into developing your own plugin, there's a bunch of resources I want to just drop links to before we go down into the specifics of writing your own. There are official developer docs, which are pretty good. Amongst other things, they include the TypeScript API. So it's some of these are really not much more than the signature, but a lot of these do provide you a lot of helpful information about finding the resources you need to make the changes you're interested in. There's even a page about building your first plugin, which will really take you through the hello world process of here's your settings page. Look, it added this thing to the node or it removed this thing, and this will get you started. And then the Obsidian community itself has a Discord channel and forum with a lot of helpful people. They're both very active. And then lastly, I wanted to drop links to a couple of the plugins that I thought were very helpful for reference. That building your own plugin guide will get you pretty far, but if you want to see examples of more complete plugins that have more uh, difficult functionality implemented, there's a Kanban plugin that will actually give you something like you would expect in Jira or Trello, which is a good example of custom components. This calendar plugin itself is a nice example of custom views. And then there's a Kindle plugin, which will sync your Kindle highlights into your Obsidian Vault. And for me, that was a nice example of logging into third-party services. And then the plugin we're going to talk about today is using React, but you can also use Felt. And there's a Todoist plugin that's written that way if you want a good example of that. Okay, so one of the very common ways people use Obsidian is for journaling or reflection or task tracking, but like on a very periodic basis. So besides just making notes about things they want to learn about or things they want to remember, they will make something like a daily note. So every day they will make a new note. And that's such a common workflow that Obsidian has a core plugin called Daily Note, which will help you create a unique note every day. What most people do very quickly is discover that they want to have a little bit more structure to those daily notes. They want a common set of prompts and headings. And so they install something like the periodic notes plugin, which will allow you to say, I want to have daily notes created, or weekly notes, or monthly notes, or yearly notes. And you can define which directories you want those to go in. So like every time it creates a daily note, let's go ahead and put it into daily notes folder. And you can define a template that you want to be used. So when creating a new daily note, you want it to always include this structure by default. And by itself, that pretty much gets a lot of people started for kind of having Obsidian as a really useful journaling or kind of task tracking tool. I wanted to give a shout out to one more plugin called Templater, which allows you to put some more to embed templates directly, or some like if you're familiar with handlebars or Jinja, some more templates will get rendered when creating those files. And so this will allow you to create more dynamic links between notes or more dynamic content within your notes. And so, for example, if you have something that looks a little bit wordy like this, this is going to get rendered when creating a note and actually take the current note's title, parse it as a date string, add one to it, and then output that as a date string. So this would be like an easy way to make a link to tomorrow's note. And so you can include things like these in your templates and end up with these nice little collections of links between your notes. And a quick call out, if you are using these kinds of plugins, it's best to get your date and naming scheme consistent up front because as you can kind of see, there's these fragile, date format strings used throughout both these plugins. So if you change these, going and updating all your notes later could be a bit of a pain. And so if you have these plugins set up, I'll give an example here. You can do things like click on today's date and it will say, hey, there's no new daily note. Do you want to create it? And you will get a fresh daily note. And you can see here that, for example, this note is already templated with a bunch of information, including those rendered templates that we just looked at. These templates themselves, like how this note was created, are available in this templates directory. And again, all this is in that linked repository. So if you want to see like the actual raw template that was parsed, it's here. And there's one for daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly as well. So if we go to like the weekly note, you'll see that, for example, it also includes links back down to like all the days in the week. And again, this is all kind of as a result of those templates. So when using these, I think this is a really common setup for a lot of people who use Obsidian. And you'll come in here and you'll do things like, well, for personally, I need to present at WebHack today. And this is where I was for quite a while with Obsidian, and really how I found Obsidian to become such a useful daily tool for me is jumping between this kind of daily planning, reflection, and the normal like work or personal study tasks I had. And what you probably quickly find is that, each day, at the end of the day, you end up with so this is a previous day's note, you end up with some mix of incomplete and complete notes. And this is the manual process I found myself doing where I would come back to previous notes and say, hey, these tasks are incomplete. Let me bring them to today's note. And this task is incomplete. Let me bring it to today's note. And of course, that's pretty silly. And so the plugin I wrote and I'll talk about now is just to kind of help automate this process of taking your previous items in a structured fashion and getting them all brought to your most current node. So a quick note on like, I guess why I did any of this in Obsidian. I think like a lot of people, I've probably used many of the task tracking apps available, like Todoist or Google Tasks, Nirvana, if you use Get Things Done or Wunderlist. But really, I think once you start using Obsidian for most of your other tasks, having one less application in your life and being able to manage one more aspect of your daily workflow inside the same app was really transformational for me. And so even with all the features that you can get from these other apps, I actually find myself having a much higher success rate and being a lot happier managing these types of things as part of like my daily Obsidian process. And so this is the plugin I wrote, and it's linked here as well, Obsidian Nested Daily To-Dos. And so you can install this from here. It will be added to the community plugins list pretty soon, but at the moment, the instructions are on this page for how to install it. Um, quickly, I'll reference like two alternatives, which is like if you are using something more full-fledged like Todoist, there are Todoist plugins, as mentioned earlier, which will actually take your Todoist items from the service and actually sync them into your Obsidian notes. So it's a good way if you're already using that kind of tool to bring that context into Obsidian. There's also another plugin called Rollover Daily To-Dos, which is a little bit more streamlined and simple, but didn't quite meet the requirements I wanted. But it's another one that's a little bit more adopted. So if you want to take a look at it for comparison too, it's another way to say, hey, I've got previous items and I want to bring them forward to my current node. So I guess a quick demo of all this plugin does. And so I'll split this and go to the previous node as well. But when you have leftover items, it will parse a certain number of days of previous notes. And here's the plugin's configuration under community plugins. So in here, there's a couple of settings exposed, which is, for example, how many previous days do you want to check? For the most part, I think checking all your previous notes might not be the most useful. Keep to-dos grouped by section, removing empty to-dos. And then since I take advantage of some of those themes that allow additional stylings of to-dos, beyond like, for example, this important item, which is uh, actually just an exclamation point. Since I take advantage of these, I wanted the ability to specify exactly which characters I wanted to support and which characters should be considered complete. So for example, if you use the um, canceled item, I wanted to consider this a completed item and not carried over. So when running this, all it does, I've added a ribbon command on the side, or there's also the command palette if you really want to run it that way. But when you run this, it will grab all those previous ones and bring them into today's note. It's really simple. And because it's simple, you'd expect that the plugin is also simple, and it is. And so we're going to jump into kind of what tools are available for writing a plugin and take a look at this one as an example of how you could write your own. Okay. So again, if you go to the official developer docs, there is a very clear like hello world, build your first plugin page. And again, if you decide you want to build a plugin, I would recommend going through that process. The basic steps it will recommend though are starting with an empty vault, since while you're developing your plugin, a lot of the things you will run could be destructive and you don't want to delete all of your own notes. And then you can fork and clone a sample plugin, which has a lot of the scaffolding already in place. And you clone that plugin directly into your Vault's .obsidian plugins directory. You can build it or run dev, npm run dev, which will watch for changes in the plugin and rebuild it anytime you change the source files. And then you can enable that plugin in your Vault. And finally, there is another plugin called the hot reload plugin, which anytime this is for developers, and anytime it notices that one of your plugins has been rebuilt, it will automatically reload the newest version in your Vault. So without this plugin, every time you rebuilt your plugin, you would have to come into Obsidian itself and like disable, re-enable the plugin to get the latest version. So by enabling this hot reload plugin, all that happen automatically, and then you just start hacking on the plugin. So when working on the plugin, the most useful tool is Chrome DevTools because Electron is just Obsidian is just an Electron app. So you can open up the Chrome DevTools and use them as you would in any other location. when we run, for example, my plugin, you will see the logs coming from my plugin. By default, the TS config for most plugins have the source map inlined, so it's easy for you to jump into the plugin code. And I realize some of this might be kind of small, but if you want to set breakpoints and step through your code, it all works how you'd expect. Very easy to debug this way. One more thing that I didn't notice at first was that as you're in the exploration phase of just kind of getting used to what's available in the Obsidian API, the Obsidian API is also all available in the console. So like this app with name, you can run all these Obsidian API commands yourself. So rather than going through like the whole cycle of like, is this doing exactly what I wanted it to do in your plugin? Maybe sometimes you just want to come in here and directly exercise it a bit. And then we're going to make an example change to the plugin I have to kind of just show how all these pieces fit together and how simple it can kind of be, and point out some of the main anatomy, some of the main components that make up a typical plugin. So over here, and I'll try to keep most of this larger. Over here, this is just my plugin in IntelliJ, and I'm currently running the npm run dev target, and you can see even just restarting that because of the hot reload plugin, it actually just loaded the most recent version that just rebuilt. And you can see the log saying that it was unloaded and reloaded. So the change we'll make quickly is to, let's say, let's add an emoji to carried over items to make them easier to see which items were carried over. And in fact, let me just delete the current note. That way we can start with a fresh one. So when items do carry over, I want them to, I don't know, get an emoji added to them so it's easier to see which items are new and which items are carried over, or maybe how many days the item has been carried over. And so first and foremost, a lot of plugins have a settings page, as we looked at earlier. A lot of plugins will have at least the settings split out into a separate file. And all the main pieces of the plugin are just inherit or extend really common classes like this plugin settings tab. And for the most part, you just need to implement some simple like display or load methods. In this case, there's a display method for determining which options you want to ask users for. And so let's, for example, add a new option for adding that emoji. And I'm just going to copy an existing toggle to kind of save some time here. Okay, so every time it's toggled, let's update a setting called add emoji, which doesn't exist yet. And you can see that for the most part, a lot of these things just have a like a save settings reference here for any time these are saved. Now, if we go into the main file for the plugin, a really common pattern you'll see too is like an interface for bundling your settings together. And let's go ahead and add the add emoji boolean. And then default settings as well, of course, for if users haven't set that. Nice. So if we lose focus, it's rebuilt. And you can see the hot reload plugin already reloaded it. If we look at the settings page now, there's now an add emoji setting in here. When users do update settings, these are actually just persisted to the plugins directory in a little data.json file. So if we open up, here we go. If we open up this plugins data.json file, you can see everything the user set. And when plugins are, when settings are loaded or saved, you can, if you need to do any transformation as part of writing those, you can, but it's usually a very simple process. Like for example, there's a little load settings and save settings that for the most part just calls save data to write that JSON file. Now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit instead of wiring this all the way through and just say, let's assume that we've wired that setting through. There's a to string in here where I have been, taking the data representation of those to-dos and adding them as a text string. And let's throw, I don't know, a little clock emoji in there, save it. So when running now, you should get the exact same results. Oh, if we remove all the breakpoints. I'm gonna refresh when I did. Okay, there you go. So that kind of cycle of hacking on your plugin is really painless. And if something does go wrong, the Chrome Dev Tools are an easy way to step through your code. Uh, One final note, and then we can talk more about any of the plugin internals if you'd like, or what kind of typical parts of the Obsidian API are useful. One final note, though, on the plugin workflow is when it comes to testing, the Obsidian TypeScript API is there are not mocks available for it. So the portions of your plugin that do make Obsidian calls, like for example, the main lifting in my plugin will call a this app vault process, which will atomically update the contents of a node. If you are writing test, like in Jest, you need to kind of separate these parts out from the rest of your plugin because these are not available in the test environment. And so there's a link here where there are people who discuss that kind of limitation. And in most plugins, what you'll find is either people are running the mocks themselves or they've just separated the Obsidian API portion from their business logic portion. That is it for the main walkthrough. And so I think maybe we can kind of start Q&A early, or if people have more interest in, kind of which parts of the Obsidian API are useful for types of behavior, um, we can discuss that as well.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I'm curious about like how you make use of the graph view on the bottom right of your screen. Is there,
Yeah,
there a way to like organize your nodes and make these graph view useful?
the graph view is probably the most visually attractive part of Obsidian, right? I will say personally, I get satisfaction out of the graph view existing, but I don't leverage it in a meaningful way. Yeah, I know there are people who, for example, if depending on your mindset and strategy with Obsidian, there are people, for example, who never want to have notes without links or orphaned notes. And sometimes I think maybe they will go try to figure out if they have notes that aren't connected to the graph, like how do they refine those notes? But I don't think I have any good insight into how to get more out of the graph view. I do think like if you look at anyone's vault who's been using Obsidian for a year, it is very fun to see, the many hundreds of connections that all kind of come out of it.
Yeah, when I investigate this tool and I heard people saying about like how these features useful for like brainstorming or organize their mind. So like that's why I'm curious about these ones.
Hmm. Yeah. I do think if you're doing if a lot of people will create a vault for a specific purpose, maybe not have one vault for their whole life. Maybe it's a vault for working on their thesis research or a specific project. And I think if you're doing research, the graph view probably does help you more naturally reflect the information that you're collecting and organizing. And I would assume that in those cases, it's a lot easier to kind of strive to make sure that the graph is clear. And hopefully that means that your organization and understanding is clear. But at least personally, I use Obsidian for almost everything and a lot of it in the same vault. So my graph is just full of tons of clusters about different topics.
I see. Thanks.
Oh, this is really cool. I learned a lot. I've been using Obsidian for a year on a daily basis, but I still feel like I'm a newbie. And I think we kind of segued to the Q&A session. So feel free to raise your hand or jump into the chat asking question. Oh, we got one question from the chat. Oh, it's from Pars.
I can just say it out aloud. So basically, my comment was as a reply to 550, if I'm saying your name correctly. What I have done for my personal Obsidian is that I have created one note for pretty much every single entity in my life. And as a result, I have like a few hundreds of notes, and they are all cross-linked to each other. So for example, um, people in the company would have a note regarding themselves, and they would be associated to my employer, and people in other companies would have nodes associating them to their employer. So whenever I click on Indeed in my graph view, I would see everything associated with Indeed. And that's pretty useful if you want to search for some specific item, but you don't know what it is, or you don't know what the name is, but you know what it is linked to.
I see. That's interesting.
Yeah, +1. And it does support, maybe you're already familiar too, but it does support like enabling tags to show up in it as well. So if you are making use of tags for something like the entities he's talking about, um, to do that sort of like highest level grouping, sometimes that can be helpful. And then a question from Jeremy, do you have recommendations for a complex project management use case like syncing with Jira? There are plugins for syncing with Jira and like Confluence, for example. Um, I wish I had installed the Kanban one in here too. I guess we could install it, but it might take a minute. There are plugins that sync fairly well. I have not had a lot of personal luck. Depending on the company you're at and what version of those tools that they're using, I sometimes find it really difficult to sync uh, information. So I've had more luck using the Obsidian standalone plug, like the non cloud services, like using the Obsidian Kanban plugin. But maybe somebody else has more experience with kind of project management use cases here.
I'm also curious about like how's the mobile support for Obsidian.
The mobile support's really good in my experience. And that's another thing I didn't mention in the plugin development, but you can specify if your plugin is mobile friendly and whether you've tested it with mobile. Debugging issues on mobile, of course, is a little bit more painful compared to just opening the Chrome DevTools. But most of the plugins I use all work seamlessly on native, including, for example, Excalidraw, which is like shockingly well integrated. This works well on mobile as well. Even like if you have an iPad and you want to sketch system diagrams on your iPad, a lot of this just works pretty flawlessly.
That's nice.
I recently discovered that you can also use Mermaid inside Obsidian, and it also works natively.
Yeah. Mermaid. Um, And there's a lot of plugins that will help export your Obsidian or publish your Obsidian notes to other formats or other surfaces, and most of them do a good job of preserving things like mermaid diagrams and key destination surface.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm also
Um,
yeah, go ahead.
but
go ahead.
I'm just curious about like because I'm a Bear user, and I wonder like do you guys have any like tips to organize or categorize your notes? Because in my case, like I'm using Bear, but although like Bear is using the tag system probably similar to Obsidian, but I think I realized I never used really find stuff by tag. Basically I just search by tags and um so I wonder, is it because I didn't organize my notes well, or yeah, I wonder how you organize, like doing knowledge management or organize your notes.
I think people have a lot of different approaches. I would say personally, I end up using a combination of folders, tags, and links. There are certain things that like a folder I think just makes sense because I already definitely know that this is like a typical type of note. So like in this demo, we have like weekly notes or daily notes in a folder. But for my personal vault, like I do have a folder of like book reviews or book summaries. And for example, that is a very clean organization style. But then some more, I wouldn't say ambiguous topics, but some less like clearly constrained topics, I make heavy use of tags. Like this note actually has to do with three different things. It has to do with like a how-to guide and Python and this specific project. And so I'll tag it with all of those. And the search functionality for like searching by tags in Obsidian does work pretty well. I know this might be a little hard to see, but searching for like by tag, um, there isn't a there's an abundance of LLM plugins happening for Obsidian right now, and I haven't used many of them, but a lot of those show a lot of promise for like even running local LLMs to say, find my note or please tell me what my vault says about this topic. I think looks very interesting.
I see. Thanks.
Other than tags, do you have other like tricks? Do you have other takeaways to like how to organize your notes better, like easier to find or easier to search?
There is a topic creating mocks, like MOCs, for your Obsidian notes that I use sparingly, but I've started using. If I can find a good example of it online. But using some of the other plugins like Data View. So we didn't talk about a lot of the kind of popular established plugins, but there's a lot of plugins that support querying the rest of the notes in your vault. And so you can do things like basically building tables of content or indexes, like one note that finds all the other notes that meet certain criteria. Like in this note, I want it to contain a list of all the notes in my vault that are about books I read in 2023. And like using stuff like the metadata we showed earlier, you can dynamically create that list in your note. So I wish I had made one in here. But if you Google like Indeed mocks MOC map of contents, you'll see a lot of examples. Hmm. I think for people who end up with a lot of information, MOCs or mocks end up being one of the tools that I see people, not everyone's bought in on, I think, but making use of to organize their information more.
Oh, thanks.
Have you purchased Obsidian or are you using the free community plugins?
Uh, Since I don't publish anything out of Obsidian or collaborate for any work stuff, I don't have a commercial license, although I wish we would use it like in a commercial setting. And then I use the Obsidian sync option now for syncing between devices. I will say I used to use like the iCloud, just like an iCloud drive to sync between devices, and that worked fine. But the paid Obsidian sync is affordable and works really well. One last I guess in the realm of plugin development, one last shout out I want to give is if you're wanting to hack run Obsidian and you want to just basically run JavaScript, but you don't want to build a plugin like all those other pieces we're talking about of saving settings and your plugin being loaded, there is a plugin called Obsidian Custom JS where you can just write JavaScript snippets, like one script per file, and then inside of your notes, you can invoke them. And so, for example, I've got one in my other vault, like a little JavaScript snippet that will create a table of contents at the top of a note, since Markdown doesn't have like a native concept of here's a table of contents based off the headings. And yeah, this is a plugin you could look into if you're interested in like, I just want to run some JavaScript and I don't want to build a plugin.
So about the plugin, do you have any, is there any performance concern?
Um, so when you enable plugins, there is something you can turn on like debug startup time to see how long different plugins are taking to load. So if we just reload Obsidian, um, you'll see Excalidraw is a very complicated plugin and definitely takes the most time. So there's like probably load time performance depending on what you're doing. Um, and yeah, I think if you're going to do any heavy lifting in your plugin, are you going to concerned about like memory leaking or just actual runtime and tying up the application?
Yeah, like runtime, or I'm not sure like how's the runtime look like for Obsidian plugin. It's like run one load one time in memory when you call it, or like it's in the background all the time.
Yeah, the plugins get loaded one time. Unless if you want to set up like periodic processing, there's documentation to do that. Like if you want to set up a periodic event that your plugin subscribed to do some periodic processing. But for the most part, then your plugin is doing nothing unless it's invoked via like a ribbon icon or the command palette.
Mm. Does
But yeah,
Obsidian your like uh resource consuming plugins?
that's a really good question. My guess would be that it does not have that level of policing for the plugins, but I'm truly not sure.
Okay.
And
Aside,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
aside from the plugins that you already recommended, are there any interesting plugins that you would like to shout out and show off?
A good question. Hold on. Let me stop for a minute and switch to my vault, which is less shareable. So for personal life, a lot of these are very personal. I do think the Kindle plugin, as mentioned earlier, is wonderful. Um, maybe I could just do this. There is some what you might consider basic functionality that doesn't work quite as well as it should with just the core Obsidian plugins. So I think maybe the most kind of comical example is there's an underline plugin to make the command U or control U key underline a word. And so I think that's on the simplest and kind of silly end of the spectrum. Um, oh, sorry. And by the way, if you download this vault, it has Vim bindings enabled, and you can disable those in the editor settings. But there's a vimrc plugin for adding a vimrc file. Uh, Obsidian charts is nice if you want to embed graphs in your pages, and those graphs can be based off other data in your notes, which is really nice. Natural language dates is similar to how in a Google Doc you can say like at today or at yesterday. Natural language dates will give you that same kind of replacement. Let's see. Excalibur I mentioned, but I do think it's incredible. And then data view. So some of the slides I showed had links at the bottom saying like, links to other notes that reference this one, powered by data view. Data view is like an incredibly powerful Obsidian plugin. And so I think once you start using it, you find out how many ways you can like process and parse the rest of your notes to create dynamic list of like these. When you're talking about like how to find the rest of the notes in your vault that meet some criteria, like data view is the main plugin that does that. And then advanced tables is not necessary, but basically advanced tables will make, if you are making markdown tables in your document, it makes that entire process a lot less painful.
Thank you. I will check them out.
Mhm. Any questions? Feel free to jump into the meeting or ask in the chat. I used to use the slide plugin, which is not a community plugin, it's core plugin to do some simple presentation with codes. It's so easy to use that to do like coding presentation because the code block is just so handy.
There's an Obsidian slides. I think maybe it's called Obsidian presentation for like creating presentation slides that I was hoping to have time to test out for this, but did not get to.
Mm. I didn't. I haven't tried, but I tried another one and it doesn't really work. So that's cool. Mm. Jeremy asks, it's hard to link items between vaults. That's a concern. Why am I? It's hard to link items between vaults.
Yeah, I don't have any solutions to that. But if you're using multiple vaults, I think I've run into that problem. I don't know if someone has a better solution. And I think that's part of the motivation for sometimes wanting to put everything into one big vault.
Yeah. All right, so I guess that's it. Thank you for sharing, and that is pretty insightful, and I do learn a lot, and I guess, yeah, I'll try. I can do plugin later after this talk. Thank you, and thank you guys for joining this meetup, and have a nice vacation. And I guess I will see you next year. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
That's fun.
everyone.